Another thing that state and federal...
What about the First Amendment? What about that one?
Go outside and talk all you want. Okay.
You know, I'm gonna ask you to do me a big favor, okay? You know, we have our difference of opinion, but we should have respect for each other's. Now, hang on a second, okay? Hang on a second.
Thanks for wasting
Sunnyvale's
tax money.
Yeah, fine. See, that's the whole point. Let me give you a little bit of story here so you understand why this is important, but even those on the opposite side of what I believe on. When I brought this issue to Sunnyvale City Council, I had folks like you screaming and yell at me. And then after the meeting, I met with a group of you and I said, well, why don't we sit down and have a conversation and let me know how we can work together to do something on a sensible level. And they said, yeah, let's get together, let's meet, let's talk. Not one person met with me. Not one. You know why? You know why?
Pointless.
Because you rather, not you, but people like that rather scream and yell and say, let's sit down. If you got an issue, Mayor, let's sit down and talk together and see what we can do. And that's, hang on a second, you particular, okay? You particular. Now all we're saying here is we're putting an issue out here, and what I request from you is why don't we get together on both sides of this issue and see if we can come to something that's sensible for both sides to live with. But all we get here is, it's not. We've got people who speak, you see, here's my point right here. You got people who are going to give you information, we got time for questions, we'll get into this discussion, but let's do it right and respect each other's opinion. Screaming out and yelling doesn't help anything. All right?
Yes, I did.
And you know what happened when that discussion didn't happen between the group that wanted to speak with me or said they were?
What, an hour and a half?
68% of the Sunnyvale residents voted against what you wanted to stop. Now, if you want input and have a good dialogue, then let's listen whether we agree or not, and then after sit down and say, what can we do to help each other? Period.
I think we've all gotten pretty energized today and are going to go out and do some great things later today. But this is our opportunity, regardless of our viewpoint, to hear from some people that you really want to hear from.
You only want to hear from one side. You only want to force your opinion on everybody else. You're not going to get a chance.
So we're going to keep going with the forum. If you have comments or questions, please put them on those yellow cards. Here's one right here that Nandini can pick up and bring up. We're going to be asking them in the order that they were posed. So we're going to have Laura proceed with her presentation because we have another panel coming up shortly. And we want to have time for your questions and comments.
All right, try it again. So another thing that state law does not require is security requirements in a dealer's premises during business hours. And the state also allows minors to enter firearms dealers' locations. Also very important is inspections. So the federal government has an agency called ATF, which is responsible for inspecting firearms dealers. However, they are very underfunded and they are not able to inspect all of the many firearms dealers in the country. California is similarly under-resourced and unable to inspect dealers the way they need to be inspected. So local governments can take it upon themselves to require dealer licensing and have inspections on a regular basis. So it simply makes sense that the police chief of a local government would want to know what's happening in a dealer's premises to make sure laws are being followed. Lastly, on the topic of regulating dealers is ammunition record keeping. This is a very important policy that's been adopted in several places in California. And it's very simple. When someone comes in and buys ammunition, their information is recorded. Information about who they are and when they bought the ammunition. Police use this to look at those records and compare them to see if any of the people buying ammunition are prohibited purchasers, prohibited under state or federal law from owning a firearm. They can then go and inspect those people's They can go to those people's homes and talk to them and find out whether they indeed have firearms. And many times they do. That's why they're buying ammunition. So cities like Sacramento have demonstrated the many firearms that were illegally possessed that they've confiscated thanks to ammunition record keeping. Another ordinance that is a very good idea for local governments is requiring the reporting of lost or stolen firearms. So if you own a firearm and it's missing one day, you should have the responsibility to report that to law enforcement so they can go about trying to investigate what happened to your firearm. And later, if your firearm turns up at a crime scene, the police can look at the records and see that, okay, this was reported lost or stolen, and we know where this gun came from.
Criminalize the victim.
Another avenue for local governments is gun show regulation. There's a lot that can be done to regulate the gun shows that are taking place on our government property. And then prohibiting the possession of large capacity ammunition magazines. The state prohibits sale but not possession of these magazines. These are magazines that can hold 10 or more rounds generally. There are several other ideas that we have for local ordinances, and we've actually written model laws at the request of ABAG. So we have a whole list of different model laws that we've written that local governments can use. We also have resolutions, model language for those as well. And we're available. We're a nonprofit, and we provide free assistance to local governments. So if you're interested in doing something at the local level, feel free to contact us. So I want to turn now to something a little bit more technical, the legal side of all of this. As I mentioned before, preemption is the main issue you have to consider when you want to do anything at the local level. So preemption is when a higher level of government removes authority from a lower level of government. And the federal government does this to the states, and individual states can do this to their local communities. Most of the states have removed authority from local governments to regulate firearms. California is one of a handful of states that do allow local governments to regulate. There are exceptions, though. You can't just regulate anything at the local level. The state legislature has specifically said that 3 areas are off limits to local governments. And those areas are licensing and registration. So a local government cannot require a firearms owner to have a license or to register their gun. They cannot regulate concealed handguns, and they cannot regulate imitation firearms. So any type of local regulation that touches on any of these areas is going to be preempted. The other kind of more complicated area of preemption is implied preemption. Now this is when the state has not come out and said you can't regulate in a certain area, but courts have sometimes found, very rarely actually, that the state has regulated so thoroughly in a certain area that there's no room for local governments to act. Fortunately for us, this doesn't happen very often in California. The recent case law has shown that, actually not even recent, in the last 20 years, that California courts really give a lot of leeway to local governments when it comes to implied preemption. So as long as you stay away from those 3 areas I mentioned, the courts really do allow local governments to do quite a lot with firearms. The other issue that I want to address is the Second Amendment. And I think most people are aware that the United States Supreme Court has, in the last several years, ruled on this issue. In the Heller case and the McDonald case. And in those cases, they departed from decades of jurisprudence. And they decided that the Second Amendment does provide an individual right to bear arms in the home.
It doesn't say in the home.
The court made it very clear, and this is Justice Scalia who wrote for the majority. His opinion is very clear that this is not an absolute right. Those are the exact words that he used. And he even gave some examples of the types of laws that would be presumptively lawful under the Second Amendment. So, fortunately, this has not actually been a barrier to gun laws. after these
That's
cases
what
were
it's about.
decided, there was, as one would
There's
predict,
different
a flood of
interpretations.
litigation.
It's
People
black
were
and white.
challenging, and they still are,
There's
every
interpretations
state and
of the
federal and
Second
local
Amendment.
law that they possibly
Supreme
can.
Court has ruled
And they're
and the
losing.
board-
So one of the things, like I said, one of the things we
Most
do is we
recently,
track
they-
litigation,
they-
and we've reviewed over
broadly
800
interpreted
cases
the
in which
Amendment.
people have tried to attack gun
Whether it
laws
was an original
using
intention
these
or not,
new
that's the way they
cases,
ruled.
and they've failed in almost every case.
Examples.
So you're in very good company if you're a local government that would like to enact something at the local level to regulate firearms. For many, many years, California communities have been enacting ordinances at the local level that they have decided are what's needed for their communities. And we have kind of a database of all of these different local laws and which cities have adopted them. So if you're in a city and you have an idea for something and you want to know who else has done this, you can contact us and we will let you know. We're actually in the process of updating this. It's a very, very complicated project. But we should have it done in the next few months. And one of the really important things about local law is that it tends to trickle up to the state level. So some of our best laws that we have at the state level started as local ordinances. So for example, I talked earlier about the fact that in California you can't sell a handgun that is considered an unsafe handgun. So it has to be tested, it has to be vetted, basically, by the Department of Justice. This started out as what we call junk gun bans, and in local communities across California, they decided they had enough of these cheap guns that were being sold that were very poor quality and often caused accidental deaths. There are many other ordinances like this that the state looked at these local communities and said, this seems like a good idea, it seems to be working, and so we'll try it at the state level. The last thing I want to talk about is two cases that are pending right now that we are involved in at the Law Center. And that's the Pleasant Hill lawsuit and the Sunnyvale lawsuit. So in both of these cases, there were local ordinances were enacted, and there were lawsuits brought challenging the ordinances. And one of the things that we do at the Law Center is we provide pro bono attorneys to represent the cities, if the cities are interested. So we have a large network of large firms in San Francisco that are willing to take on these cases. And so they're both at the very early stages. We did have a victory in Sunnyvale, but it's a very early victory. So we'll still be fighting on both of these fronts for some time to come. But we are very, very confident the law is on our side, and we're not concerned. But of course, these cases still take up a lot of time. You can write down on a card if you have a question. And that is it for me. I'm happy to take questions that are written down on cards.
We do have a number of questions on cards, and I have them here in the order that they came in. So I know that there's one for Professor Donahue that's a couple back in the stack, and one specifically for LCAB that's near the back. But we do want to take them in the order that they were presented.
I'm a Mountain View resident and just happened to hear about this by a third party. Why was I not sent a letter? I feel like there's some confusion that people think this is a city-sponsored event. I don't think that anybody... We're using the chambers for our event. This is... Yeah, we pay for it. So, yeah, you guys didn't.
It's our property. We pay taxes, it's our property.
Okay, I'm going back to the cards. Those are the rules. If criminals do not obey current gun control laws, how will passing more laws help? Well, so should we, under that logic, then maybe we should get rid of all of our criminal laws? Should we not have stoplights and not outlaw murder? That's such a
Bullshit.
It's not a very sensible.
That is the worst logic I've ever heard.
Your argument isn't sensible.
How does the gun show loophole being closed prevent criminals from getting guns via straw buyers? That's a great question, actually. I think that I think that straw purchasing is actually a very, very complicated and difficult problem. And for anyone that doesn't know what that is, that's when somebody goes in who has a clean record, and they buy a gun, they fill out all the paperwork, they have a background check, and then but the intention is that they give it to somebody else.
Who would be stupid enough to do
I don't know that closing the gun show loophole is what actually would stop straw purchasing. I think there are probably other
What
policies
loophole
aimed
in
at that.
California?
I'm going to move to the next card just because there's a lot of questions on that one. I want to give other people a chance. If I have time, I'll go back to it. Switzerland has more guns than the U.S., but why is their crime rate way less? Probably because their laws are much, much better than ours. Okay, the next question. Just about numbers. Do you know that numbers 10 times more, I'm having trouble reading this one. Do you know that in history only slaves was, I'm sorry, I can't read this. If you want to read it, I'm happy to, yeah. When you get back to, if you want to get back to. Why are suicides included in the totals without including the other methods of suicide? That's actually really interesting, and I'm sure the professor, oh, this is for the professor. So I don't know if you want to take this.
Okay. Just on the Swiss point, because this is a common misperception. Switzerland does have a well-regulated militia. And if you're a member of the Swiss militia, you get an assault weapon in your home. You're forbidden by law to use that for self-protection. You're given a sealed box of ammunition. If you open that box of ammunition, you will be sent to jail, unless the Swiss government has officially said that the box of ammunition can be opened. And every year you must bring your box of ammunition when you do your Swiss training to see that it is still closed. So it is an extremely regulated regiment. The idea that the Swiss model would be an attractive one to the NRA is utterly fanciful. And one should keep that in mind. I know that the NRA does not reveal that information. They like the idea that there are a lot of assault weapons there, but they are extremely tightly controlled. Indeed, you're not allowed to open up the can of sealed ammunition unless you have been given orders by the Swiss government that you need to fight your way to the central meeting ground if the nation is under attack. So these guns are regulated extremely extensively. On the suicide question, as with every element here, there are many complexities. Obviously, many people, if there were no guns in the United States, that now kill themselves with guns. You saw the number, about 19,000 a year. Many of them would kill themselves in another way, so getting rid of the guns doesn't help them. But we also know that there is a not inconsiderable group of individuals who act impulsively, and if a gun is immediately accessible when they happen to be in a very low mood or moment, it can end their life very quickly. And we see this all the time, that there are many, many more attempts for suicide than end successfully. But if you attempt a suicide with a gun, it almost always is terminating in your life. So changing the level of risk is one of the benefits. It's obviously not a complete protection, but it's again one reason why if you were a gun owner, locking up that gun tightly to protect the other members of your family is a very good idea.
You were asked how many of the deaths happen by suicide. You didn't put that out. You didn't put it in proportion. How many successful suicides a year are there in the United States?
Yeah.
Don't tell us. It's a natural.
I've tried to give you the sense of how one responds to the particular question of gun suicides in this case. If it wasn't helpful, we can chat outside afterwards.
Maybe you don't know.
Okay. How can we rebuild families? So many of our social programs seem to break up families by making it necessary for unemployed fathers to leave to make wives and children eligible for assistance, medical food stamps. Obviously, these are broad social problems, and it is true that the United States is less successful than many of its competitor nations in maintaining strong and viable families, and so that's part of a larger public concern. What did the CDC recently voice concerns? The use of concealed carry seems to decrease violence, right? No. Again, there is zero, and I repeat the word zero, credible statistical support for the idea that passing concealed carry laws improve the crime situation. Zero. There are some discredited studies that the NRA loves to champion that make that point, but there's zero credible statistical support for that position.
So are you saying the CDC's report was not credible? The Center for Disease Control's report's not credible?
I've read the CDC report. It says nothing in there that...
Yes, it does.
Apparently you haven't read it.
Yeah, you got to read it again.
I've read it very carefully, sir.
Okay.
It would be absurd for the CDC to say that passing concealed carry laws reduces homicide when there is zero statistical support for that. And I've already mentioned to you the National Research Council report, which by a vote of 17-1 among the top experts on that panel decided that there was no credible statistical support for the view that more guns lead to less crime.
What are we talking about?
Okay, another question. Can cities pass the regulations vetoed by Governor Brown without risk of preemption? I think that's a great question. However, they have to be looked at one by one. So I think some of them definitely could be, and others would be a little more tricky. So I think that'd be a great thing to call our office, and we can kind of go over them one at a time. And related to that, I would say, are there any plans to get a Sunnyvale type measure passed in Mountain View or surrounding communities? I think there are other cities that are interested, and cities have been doing this for years and years, for decades, and I don't think that's going to change. I think that cities have recognized that this is a common sense public safety measure, and they really owe it to their residents to do something. There's a question here about gun-free zones, a concern that if Mountain View passed a law that made Mountain View a gun-free zone, it would draw mass murderers to Mountain View. First of all, the Second Amendment has already precluded any type of ban on handguns. So Mountain View is not going, or any city, is not going to be banning guns within a jurisdiction. That's not allowed. As far as drawing mass murderers to Mountain View because of gun-free zones, I don't think that's likely to happen. It hasn't been what's happened in other places that are gun-free zones.
Chicago.
Chicago is
Mostly
a
is.
victim to all the states that
No,
surround
because
it,
most of the criminals
that have such bad gun laws.
Why is the violence that high in those states?
Guns travel
It's not
very
about that.
easily across borders, and that's exactly why trafficking is so profitable.
Regardless of any ban.
Why
no.
are police able to buy
Well, they say it's
unsafe
gun-free,
firearms
though.
when civilians can't? So police obviously have a very different job than most people do. They are forced to deal with some of the most high-powered weaponry that is out there because of weak gun laws, and mostly in other states, because most of our crime guns are coming from Nevada and other states with weak laws. Because of that, police are facing military-style force when they go out to do their job, and that's why they need all the help they can
That
get.
wasn't a question.
That's my answer. That's why they're allowed to have the guns that they have.
Any type
They said, yeah, any
This is a
type.
question about our tax status of my organization. It has nothing to do with this forum. You can contact my organization and ask that. What result of gun microstamping? Why salvage unsafe guns? Protect against violence. It could could hurt himself, but a criminal would have a bad weapon. I'm not sure I understand this one, but I think gun microstamping, for anyone that doesn't know what it is, gun microstamping is a tool for law enforcement. So what microstamping is, it's a technology that allows a gun to imprint a serial number onto a bullet, a round, so that when the round is fired, the shell casing has this number on it. So, of course, if you're investigating a crime and you show up at the crime scene and there's a little piece of metal that has a number on it that you can trace back to an individual gun, that's going to make your job a lot easier.
Ma'am, yeah.
As I said before, I'm answering what's on the card. I'm not answering people that are shouting out. Do local laws make local government the target of civil rights lawsuits? They absolutely make them a target, unfortunately. The gun lobby is very fond of litigation, I think because they're not happy with what the public wants. If you look at pollings, especially on the issue of background checks, it's in the 80 and 90 percent of people that support these policies. And therefore, a lot of these measures are being passed, and sometimes the only avenue left, if you oppose a policy like this, is to bring a lawsuit. Doesn't mean that they'll be successful. State law still allows people to operate as FFLs from their home. Why should my neighbors have to know what business I conduct? How does a home FFL affect gun violence? Well, I think that is pretty much common sense. I think that if there are guns going in and out of a home in a neighborhood where children are playing and children are, have an expectation of safety, and yet one of the homes on their street has guns going in and out, that doesn't seem like a good combination.
I asked that question on Dave Landefeld.
Yes, I saw your question and I responded.
Has that happened anywhere where there's a home FFL where gun violence has gone up because of that guy dealing guns out of his home?
There is a gun dealer that operates out of a home in Pleasant Hill, which is where I live. And I will tell you that the community does not want a gun dealer in a home. And that is why, through the democratic process, Pleasant Hill banned it. That's what the residents wanted. Why do governments implement gun confiscation? Okay, I'm going to answer 2 more questions. Why do governments who implement gun confiscation so often turn to democide, which is governments killing their own citizens? So I think it's interesting because it illuminates this issue of confiscation. So this fear of confiscation seems to drive a lot of the arguments. And yet, in areas where there's gun registration, which we don't have in California, but which exists in other places, no guns have been confiscated. So this is already going on in the country. Some of these laws that people are so afraid of, and guns are not being confiscated. So it's not a very realistic view.
It's not true.
China, they did it.
And this one, why is the Brady score versus gun murder rate across 50 states show more restrictive states have higher gun murder rates? This brings to mind a publication that we did. We ranked all of the states based on their gun laws, and we graded them, and we did this with the Brady campaign. And we compared them to their gun death rates. And it turned out there was a very strong correlation between states with good gun laws and low gun death rates. And this takes into account suicides and unintentional deaths, like the professor was talking about. We didn't look into gun murder rates. I think that's a different issue. But we do have a publication.
How is that an issue? Isn't that what we're talking about right here?
It's an issue, but it's not something we looked at for our publication. But we did look into California. And this is a publication that we did that talks about California for the last 20 years. And the rate of gun violence in California has fallen much more significantly than across the country. So the gun death rate has fallen across the country.
So why do we
but in
need more
California,
laws?
it has fallen much more quickly because of all of the laws that California has passed. And I think that is it for me.
We have a questions here that we wanted Professor Donahue to get to, the ones that were left out of the card that had 4 questions and one card with 1 question.
Okay. In Palo Alto, a police officer had his handgun taken by a criminal. Should we now make it illegal for police to carry guns? This is actually an important question. If you remember back to the bombing in Boston at the Boston Marathon, after the 2 individuals committed the bombing, they wanted to get more weapons, and they saw a police officer and went over and killed him to get his weapon. But because his holster was a triple lock holster that most people don't know how to release, they were unable to get the gun.
You can't take off a belt?
And so it shows they did not. And it shows the value of regulating the access to guns in many settings that might not be immediately apparent. So that's I think what everybody here should be thinking about. What steps can make a difference in reducing violence? That was one episode that the MIT police officer, while he died, at least they had in place a good set of regulations that kept his gun from moving into the criminal's hands and possibly causing more mayhem. So, of course, I would not say that we should make it illegal for police to carry guns.
We should lock their holsters.
But you should think of measures that can be done to reduce the mayhem. Remember, all of risk regulation involves trade-offs. Some people might say, don't wear your seatbelt because you might get trapped if the car bursts into flames. Well, we know that could happen in some cases, but most of the time it makes a lot of sense to wear your seatbelt, so we tell people to wear seatbelts. And that is similar to the sort of analysis that you need to make when you're talking about guns. What measures will reduce the problem and what measures are ineffectual? Let's try to move towards the ones that are effective. How do we close the loophole that allows the federal government to distribute illegal weapons, such as the Fast and Furious operation, which resulted in the deaths of 2 Border Patrol agents? I think that program has been closed, thankfully. And I should
got promoted too.
I should also note that while it's obviously unfortunate when anyone gets killed, people get killed every day from guns moving from the United States into Mexico through the current unlawful trade. Okay, do you know that in history only slaves were prohibited from having weapons? Well, no, that's not true.
Yes, it is.
No, that's not true. Many countries prohibited women from having weapons. They were not slaves. But in any event, the question of prohibition is not on the table. As we've heard, the Second Amendment prohibits the prohibition of weapons. We're only interested in taking reasonable, effective measures that can reduce the total level of violence.
What is that?
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to Ms. Cataletta also for speaking. Now, we're just about a half hour behind on our schedule, and so I want to go ahead and go on to the next panel now. But if you have questions, comments, very important to raise your hand, get a yellow card, and we're going to be going through as many of them as we possibly can.
But you're not going to let us speak ever, right?
Is allowed to us. And we're going to take questions and comments on the yellow cards. So raise your hand if you need a yellow card to be able to access that. Now, I want to go on now to our last panel and bring up someone who has a very unique perspective and a unique solution in terms of local gun violence prevention. I wanted to bring up Ian Johnstone of Gun by Gun. Ian is really a leader in the technology community and a leader in the gun violence community, and has found a very unique way to bring these two fields together to allow people to participate in the community and